And yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
Miss
Hey,
Cat.
Mary. Yeah, no, I totally recognized her. I've watched a ton of her movies, and I have kind of I'm mixed on her. I'm not sure
Okay.
how I feel about her, but
Yeah, about to say these are the only two movies No Time to Die and this one. I think it's the only two movies I've seen of her. I know she's a big star. Was it is it Europe or South or
she came from South America. Hey,
oh
Jeremiah.
South America? Oh, okay,
Yeah.
Hello.
somewhere other than yeah. This shows how much I know of
Are we talking about
international.
Ana de Armas?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's in Blade Runner 2049.
Oh, okay, I haven't seen
Yeah.
that.
She played Marilyn Monroe. She just had a big
Mhm.
like Marilyn Monroe movie. She did
Oh,
what else did she did? She did a terrible, there's a terrible movie on Apple. It is awful. I can't even remember the name of it, but she and what's his name who plays Ransom in this. They're in it
oh,
together.
Chris Evans.
Chris Evans, and it's a horrible movie. It's terribly
Oh,
done. It's really bad. Um, but yeah, anyway, it's funny. She's
oh yeah,
it's a
yeah.
yeah.
What did I
So
just?
I'm not totally sure that I'm sold on her. She was in a weird one with Ben Affleck, um, in which one of them is killing her. They're married, and one of them is killing her boyfriends, and you're not sure if it's her or Ben Affleck.
Uh,
Yeah,
okay. This
yeah,
Affleck do a bunch of. I thought was he in Gone Girl too?
yeah. He was in Gone Girl too. It's
Okay,
a
I
very
see.
Gone
I've
Girl
heard of the
role.
film. But I say at this point, I've heard so much about that film. It's like, yep, I don't need to see it now. But it's
Yeah,
not
that's a
my
weird one.
kind of
I actually
film.
that's one of those few ones that I thought the book was better than. I'm sorry, that I thought the movie was better than the book. Did
Oh, okay.
y'all anybody
Yeah,
else read the
that
book?
is.
Yeah, it's a fun one. It's a weird the book but the movie does a better job of tracking the female character than the
Mm,
book does. The book kind of leaves her out, and the ending of the movie is different if I'm remembering correctly. The ending of the movie is different than the ending of the book, and the ending of the movie I felt like did it better
oh,
because I read the book first and then I watched the movie and I was like, oh, this is better. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But he has one of those with Anna de Armas where he's pretty much playing the same like Gone Girl role, which is this like, I don't know, tired old older husband of a
mm.
like quasi crazy spouse, and he's like, exhausted all the time, half drunk all the time. Yeah, it's a weird role, but anyway, that's it. That's my experience with Anna de Armas. I like her in
Okay.
this one though.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, I liked her. Yeah, I liked her in all the two films I've seen her in.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right, before we get into Knives Out, hey Calvin, while people show up, let's do some writing updates. How's everybody doing? What you working on? Where's writing at? You publish anything recently?
No,
Let's
no,
catch
no.
up.
Okay.
Scott, how's your world building going?
I was going, yeah, basically, I escaped the trap of falling too much into it. So yeah, it got to the point. It's like, yeah, there's more I want to get done, but I have enough to move forward. So I'm just going to move forward and maybe try to do just little bits on the side if I can. I'm experimenting with my own type of spreadsheet of just track my sprints and maybe have a little reminders say, okay, you probably should do some wheel building and you probably should organize your notes and you probably should do some of this other stuff that I know I should do, but never
Yeah,
actually make any time for.
gotcha. Yeah, I get that.
So yeah,
Well,
I'm drafting again. So I'm hopefully I'm gonna finish the scene today. If
nice. Calvin, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I'm battling through COVID, so I'm going to keep my mic off so I don't infect
Oh, I'm so sorry, man. You feeling all right? You surviving?
it. It's different than I thought it would be.
Okay.
I'm just very tired and foggy.
Yeah. Is this your first time having it?
Yeah, I thought I was going to be the last person in the world who didn't have it, but then,
Yeah. I've had it twice. maybe
All
3
right.
times. There's a potential that I had it once and I just never got tested, but
Yeah,
it's not fun. You got to take care of
yeah.
yourself.
I've
Don't make any big decisions, Calvin.
yeah.
When I had it, I had to be real careful not to make any decisions.
That's right. Not to purchase anything online. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Mhm.
Keep
I've
me
got
away
a
from
freeze on
everything.
my bank account.
Nice.
Wow. Yeah. As far as I know, I've never had it.
Jeremiah, what are you writing?
I haven't been doing as much in the last month or so. It's been a crazy month. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to get back into it. The gears are rusty. So
Yeah.
Mm,
I feel
working
like
on
we
that.
all do that. Like I know I do. Like June, July are always weird months where it's like I'm
Mhm.
either I've had Junes and July where it's like this is my most prosperous time ever because there's nothing happening. But I've also had June and July's where I'm like, wait, do I write? I don't even remember if I write them.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
yeah, I
Those
totally
tend to be
get
the
that.
most challenging months for me, I think.
Yeah.
In summertime for some reason, but it's too hot.
Yeah, exactly. It's hot. There's been a lot of like family stuff that's been a
Mhm.
little bit topsy-turvy. So it's just been busy.
Yeah. Yeah. Mary, how about you?
I'm good. Since I went back and listened to the mini conference on the intimacy, vulnerability, and sex, I'm more than editing. I'm looking at the pieces I've done before, and I'm trying to see if I have all those points in there, and if not, I'm rewriting it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
So
Yeah. I am still trying to figure out where my head is. I'm trying to finish I'm trying to get back into writing the sequel to a book we published in 2023 and I'm struggling to like find the time to do it. I got a dialogue doctor book I'm working on that I can't quite
oh really?
get my head around. Yeah, I'm finally doing the character voice encyclopedia. So hopefully that'll
Okay.
be out in October, but
Okay.
I actually have to get it done. I have 100 personality types outlined in a spreadsheet and I have to format them now onto personality types of voices and I have to format them into a book. So I'm slowly working on that.
Hmm.
And part of it is, I don't know if y'all are this way. I have to catch the vision for a project. Like I need to be able to conceptualize it in my head before I can actually finish it. And I'm struggling to conceptualize it in my head. I'm like, I'm not
Yeah.
sure how this looks and what it does. So yeah, I'm working on that. But yeah, that's me. All right. Well, thanks for coming. Let's talk Knives Out. Who watched the movie?
I watched it again.
Nice.
Yeah.
I've already seen it a couple times, so I didn't watch it this time.
Yeah. I did watch it this time and I was like, I don't think I needed to watch this again. I think I had it. Yeah. All right. So let's do what specific I have like a cast thing outlined.
Mhm.
We can get to that or not get to that.
Yeah, it's
What
great.
about it do y'all want to talk about? Anything specifically that you're like, this is something I found I want to discuss with the group?
Well, I guess one thing was, the fact that, on one hand, it's obviously, it's a Benoit Blanc movie like a Sherlock or a Hercule Poirot, but it's what I was seeing is Marta is the vehicle. Ben,
Yeah,
I
that's
I
great.
couldn't tell if Benoit actually changed at all. I was like, he hasn't changed at all.
Awesome.
Maybe
Yeah.
little tiny bits, but nothing meaningful. Whereas Marta actually,
That's awesome. So yeah,
she
we
goes
can
from
we can definitely talk about like character change. Who's the vehicle? Like who are we emotionally living with? And they're weird in detective novels. You're totally right. But yeah, so we'll totally talk about that. And
Insight on plot and subplot. I mean, who thinks of things like that? I mean, I would not. I'm glad I saw it again because years ago I think I walked out. I was bored when it first came out, so I watched it today again. But I mean, it kind of was interesting. I love the end. Of course, the end was great. The payoff was great. But leading up to it, like finding out that what's his name, Ransom, is the one who really caused Harlan to commit
Mhm.
suicide to protect Marta's mother or family.
Yeah.
Kind of a, wasn't that much of a high. I mean, it was kind of like, okay, is that normal for these kinds of, this kind of genre?
Yeah, so
Where,
we can talk about that too. Let's talk about the payoff and what it's like when you find the villain and all that kind of stuff. Because that's all stuff that we can, and we can talk plots and subplots and how you build those.
Mm.
Those are solid. I think those are some solid places to start. So let's start with kind of an open question. What did you like? And I'm not necessarily, when we look at a movie like this, we have to separate the acting and like the actor's interpretation of the characters versus the actual like construction and what's behind them. Does that make sense? Because like you may not like an actor's portrayal of something, but there is a question of like, is it the actor's portrayal of that character, or is it that the character's out of place in the cast, or is it that like something in the plot didn't work? Does that make sense? Like all that to say, when we look at movies, it's not the same as looking at a novel. Typically, if you're looking at a novel, you've got the writer, you've got maybe an editor or two, but primarily the writer whose work you're looking at. When you're looking at a movie, there was 100 people involved in like sculpting this thing. And it's Rain, I can't remember his last name, Johnson?
Yeah.
Rian
Yeah,
Johnson.
Rian
Yes.
Johnson. Yeah, it's Rian Johnson's vision, and Rian Johnson's the director, and Rian Johnson's the writer and moving it forward. But in a movie, in a cinema setting, like everybody has participation. It's a team sport. So
Right, yeah.
I put that caveat just to say, like, we are kind of deconstructing things today, and anytime we look at a movie and that we're like, okay, we're going to deconstruct and talk about how this works, knowing that like this is kind of a book that has 10 authors, like that's been passed around. So
interesting.
there's a
Yeah.
little bit of, so I just want to put that in there. But that being said, what did you like about story, plot, characters? What was done well?
I think I liked, there is, Rian Johnson for me, sort of is really known for being for his subversions and such. So yeah, this is basically sort of feels like, sort of a subversion on the, mystery, because for the most part, you're told exactly what happened. Now, there are certain details left out, but you're mostly told what happened. And of course, one of the reactions I watched, somebody catched onto the sort of the plot hole in that he would have shown symptoms long before, basically the whole, oh, you show symptoms at this point. Yeah, he didn't, he wouldn't have shown, he would have started showing symptoms before he, basically committed suicide. So that
Yeah.
might have been a tell. The other thing I noticed when I was watching it this other time, he wrote down the last thing he wrote. The last thing this famous author wrote was how he was being killed. I think that might have been a clue, but of course,
And I will say that
I really like that part,
Yeah.
and just
that's a big hole. That's a struggle with writing detective novels. As somebody who's written a couple, it's you got to get all the details right, because mystery readers will come for you. Like they are paying attention and they know what's going on and they're looking for those holes. The plot has to work out. Like it's all got to fit together. And the plot has to work out in a way that part of what makes a good mystery is that the plot has to work out in a way that it is obvious and surprising. So like, oh, now that I'm at the end, this makes perfect sense. Like my son and I were watching it last night, and we kept laughing about how now that we know how it ends, it's very clearly Ransom the whole time. There's even the grandmother even looks out the window and says, Ransom, is that you? Right?
Yeah.
Like you're like, oh, she's literally naming the killer 10 minutes into the movie. But it's but that's a good mystery. Everything has to align to something that is obvious and yet still totally surprising to the story consumer. Yeah, and that's Scott. I hadn't thought about the Notebook. That's an interesting.
Yeah, I just
You're
picked
totally
up
right,
on it,
though.
and this is probably what, third or fourth, or I'd seen it at least three. This is like the third time I've seen it, and I've seen what probably three people react to it, and you see lots of clips
Yeah.
and react to it. So it's like,
That's funny.
it's a great film. I still enjoy it. It's a great thing. It's just, I love the cast.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
So the cast,
it's hard to take apart because it's like it's the cast that they all do such a good job. This is like
yeah. Anything else about it we left? Anything else stick out to anybody that you're like, man, this was done well in the storytelling?
I don't know if you probably all caught it, but I did a double take when Benoit, however you say his name, he just shows up. He's not there, and when the police talk to the first two, but then his body is sitting there without any introduction, and it's like they just put him there, without any. Did you catch that?
Yeah, he's always there.
No,
you can only
Is it-
see his legs in the
Oh,
when he's
really?
talking to the first
I'll
two.
have to rewind it. Okay,
He's
I
always
didn't-
present. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't see. I thought he just appeared. Okay.
Yeah, no, I was watching, I was actually looking for him because I was trying to figure out whose point of view those scenes were in.
Mhm.
Like who is the vehicle we're following, and he is there. He's just
Okay.
he's a little off camera and his legs are sticking out from the
Okay.
piano bench, but he's
Okay.
present.
They must have showed more leg than when I saw it.
Yeah. And I knew if we're supposed to be in his POV, we would see him because Rian Johnson's really smart about the visuals and what's present in a scene. He's really smart about it. Even down to like small details like the coffee mug. Did anybody notice the coffee mug?
Yeah.
This show starts off with the coffee mug, my
She's
house,
holding it at the end.
my
Yeah.
rules,
my
my
coffee, my rules.
Yeah, which defines Harlan's personality. And then at the end,
He's holding it.
yeah, we can talk about this too. But another thing Rian Johnson does in that kind of detail work is every time a character is introduced, they tend to introduce their personality. So like one of the first things Marta says is, I don't know what to do now. Right? Like they're introducing they all introduce their conflict the first time they speak. And so there's Rian Johnson does that in all their movies. It's an interesting technique to like, especially when you have a giant cast like this, to not play around and just get right to like, hey, here's the heart of this person. Here's who this person is. Like the first time we see Meg, the daughter, she's the first member of the family introduced. She immediately comes to Marta's defense, and she ends up being the kind of positive person in the family. Does that make sense? So like you get these direct, quick, fast definitions of characters in a large cast that have like, hey, this is the single note of this character, so that you don't have to, where like we see Marta's family right away. Her mom is like high drama and her sister is super rebellious. And you're just like, oh, these are two one-note characters that stress out Marta. Like that's their role. Anyway, it's just a really interesting technique by Rian Johnson. Anything else y'all liked? Anything else stood out that y'all were like, this was cool?
He's really good at plants and payoffs.
Ooh, talk about that.
The fake knife especially is the most obvious one, but there's a lot of really like good things. Like you already brought up the mug, which is kind of he uses them in all kinds of different ways.
Yeah.
Like whether it's a character tell or whether it's a plot detail or whatever, like there's usually like an object or a thing that is involved.
Yeah, that's
Like-
coming back.
Like the shingle.
Yeah, the shingle, the
Yeah.
broken, the part of the
Trellis.
trellis that breaks off.
Yeah.
Is she's
Yeah.
flying down,
With the
all those things
dog.
come back. And
That was so awesome.
That was great.
Yeah. And then we have Chekhov's knives display. That was
Yeah.
awesome.
I didn't catch it this time, but watching it this time was the first time I caught that Harlan says at the very beginning, sometimes you can't even tell the difference between a real knife and a fake one. It's like one of the first things he says. I didn't catch it until this watch. But yeah, those payoffs are great. Anything else that stood out to you?
Well, him using Marta as his Watson, and that was interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
How they joined together at the end. I think he became her engine right at the end, even though we have him as an anchor.
Yeah, we can talk about that. I think he's always an anchor to her.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I think she's an
Okay,
engine
yeah.
to him, but he's an anchor to her.
Okay.
Because he always stresses her out.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's never a calming force.
That's
for her.
right.
He's
Even at
always
the
a-
end, right?
Yeah, even at the end. He's always
All
a
right.
force of chaos. She overcomes that crazy, but he's not a stabilizing force for her.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was one thing I was struggling with. It's like, where are the anchors? I mean, I can sort of see where engines are, but the anchors were a little bit more difficult. But yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk cast. Because part of the reason we wanted to do this one was to focus on the big cast. And it's an interesting thing. So we've talked about how there are 5 different types of vehicles. There are lead vehicles who are the vehicles that kind of drive the story. There are supporting vehicles, which are vehicles that have kind of like a side role in the story. And then there are what we ended up calling symbolic vehicles. I don't think we have any symbolic vehicles in this story. They tend to represent a worldview and they don't change. There's chorus vehicles. You might be able to argue that some of the family members are a chorus vehicle, but they all kind of have their own journey. So I don't know that they do. And then there's third-party vehicles, which that's like a voiceover. In a film, that would be a voiceover character that's not on the screen. In a novel, it's like the narrator, if the narrator isn't one of the particular characters. This was kind of my breakdown of the vehicles. And here's why I think this is important, understanding the vehicles, because what I want to do is I want to talk about how each vehicle needs growth. And I want to talk about how in a story, like a solid story, every vehicle is going to experience some kind of growth. And we're going to understand that character's perspective in a deeper way than the other characters. So if we're writing this story, right, like if we're writing this kind of detective large cast story, or any large cast story, not just the detective large cast story, your vehicles are the characters that they need to have a depth of perspective that you think like, okay, my reader is going to connect with these characters in a deeper way than others, because we're going to get there, like we're going to see that they have better or worse versions of themselves, and that there's some kind of change and growth arc here. And if we're talking like themes and story hypothesis, the combination of these vehicles' experience is what makes the story hypothesis. So we can look in a second at how all these vehicles change, but there is a movement in this story to the revelation of knowledge and an understanding of self. So all of these vehicles in some way come to a deeper understanding of self and have a deeper picture of knowledge. So if we want to talk about like what the final payoff is in the story hypothesis, they're all looking for stability, like that's their felt need, their initial need. They kind of they all have different developing needs, but the developing need is to like sort out what happens with the inheritance. And then, but the true need that's revealed in the end is an understanding of self and knowledge. And they all come to understand themselves in a better way. That would be kind of your story hypothesis and your theme. But so you've got our 2 lead vehicles. Again, our lead vehicles are vehicles that the story is told primarily from their perspective. They're going to be in most of the scenes. There is not I mean, there's little side flashbacks, but besides those side flashbacks, there is not a scene that Marta or Benoit aren't at least present in. Rian Johnson does an interesting thing with Benoit in that for the first several, well, that's not totally true because the opening scene is Harlan's, but for the first scenes that Benoit sits in, he's silent except to show his disapproval through a piano, which is a weird, him like clicking on a piano key to indicate that he does not like the person that is speaking. So it's an interesting use, but the way you know you have a lead vehicle versus a supporting vehicle is you can remove a supporting vehicle and still have the whole story.
Mm.
You cannot remove a lead vehicle and have the whole story. And you can't remove Marta or Benoit. If you take out Benoit, you lose a whole bunch of like detective-y, them talking about decisions, them listening to other people. You lose a bunch of scenes. You definitely can't take out Marta. I will say between the two of them, if we're thinking about this as a novelization, we're going to get Marta's inner thoughts. We don't get Benoit's inner thoughts. So Rain creates a character in Marta that's very expressive and vulnerable, and a character in Benoit that's very closed. The way you'd have that impact in a novel is if you were writing from Benoit's perspective, you wouldn't hear inner thoughts. If you're writing from Marta's, you would. It's very, usually in a novel, you're going to pick one of those styles, and you're either going to give both of their inner thoughts or none of their inner thoughts. You're not going to do like, this chapter I get inner thoughts, the next chapter I don't. But in a movie, you have a little more freedom because we don't actually get Marta's inner thoughts. She's just more emotive and open about what she's feeling and what's happening than Benoit is, who's very closed. A lot of times, though, in detective movies, you get that in detective stories, like in Sherlock, like in Agatha Christie novels, which are kind of the classic ones. You don't get the character's inner thoughts. Like, you don't get to hear what the detective's thinking. You're kind of standing next to Poirot as Poirot figures out what's happening. Often the stories are told through a Watson perspective. So a lot of times those stories are told, the detective isn't even a vehicle. The detective is only present when Watson's present. So yeah, and just to be clear, there's the difference between a detective story and a thriller story is in a thriller story, you know who did it. So like John Grisham writes thrillers. It's never a question as to who did it in a Grisham novel. The question is, will the vehicle survive the story? In a detective novel, it's like, who did this thing? Yeah, so that's a little on the two different vehicles. We can analyze them more in a second. I think it's also important to note that not all of the cast members, not all of the family members are vehicles, right? So Rian Johnson does an interesting thing in his filmography where vehicles get solo shots with their face on camera, where it's just the vehicle talking and nobody else is, like, there's other people in the room, but he does a camera shot where it's just their face. These are the characters that get that. These are also the characters that grow and have their own like change arcs and subplots, which is part of a supporting vehicle. Harlan is the most supporting of the supporting vehicles because he dies and disappears. The rest of them kind of stay through the show, but his change arc is done by the time he's done talking to Marta about him dying. So before we get into personalities, any thoughts on vehicles? Any pushback? Anybody else you'd put in here is like, well, this person's a vehicle because they have scenes that we can't have with any of these without these other people? I think the only one I'd push for is Ransom. But as I was taking notes and watching, Ransom's never in a scene without Marta or Benoit. He's always with one of them. In fact, there are moments in the story where Ransom leaves, like when he's arrested and goes off, and then we find out through Benoit to Marta that Ransom has told the detectives the entire story. So that was kind of a tip to me to be like, we shouldn't think of him as a vehicle. We're not behind his eyes. He's in a different story than the rest of these. Any questions about like a supporting versus a lead vehicle?
So the main thing is if you can do without the person you were going to use as a lead, then it's a supporting. If
It's
you
probably
need
a
both,
supporting vehicle. Yeah.
if you need both to tell the story, then they're both lead.
Yeah, and you'll see supporting vehicles when you're writing, you know, they're not going to have as many scenes. These characters all have maybe 3 scenes that they're like, they're in a lot of scenes, but I mean scenes where they're actually like taking agency, where they have active movement, because they're all standing in the background all the time. But scenes where they actually have agency in your novel, there's probably like three or four for a supporting vehicle in a normal size novel. You're going to see kind of their world before, you're going to see the challenge that they have, and then you're going to see how their world falls apart. If you give them one super long scene, you can do all 3 of those things in one scene, but it ends up being a little, it feels like a novella inside a novel. You're like, why do we have this one scene with this one dude? So typically they have a couple where they're around. It just paces it better. This is also one of those where we have a turn back the clock moment where we keep seeing the same party over and over again. So that's part of what all of these characters share, is that their conflict scene all happens in the same spread of like 10 minutes, but we see that scene through each one's eyes. So you get that like rewind, let's watch that scene again through somebody's eyes. Rewind, let's watch that scene again through somebody's eyes. Also super common in detective stories like this, where the detective is seen through Benoit's, when we're seeing that, we're in Benoit's perspective. We are living the story as Benoit would live it, and we're watching them tell that scene over and over again. Does that make sense? And what's interesting that Ryan does, the reasons these become supporting vehicles is they all lie to Benoit. So they have their own perspective on the scene, and then we see what they tell Benoit. So we switch perspectives into their perspective, and then we go back to what they're actually telling Benoit. So that's what makes them not just characters that are talking to Benoit, but actual vehicles, is that we jump into their perspective.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's talk about our 2 main vehicles. Marta, so like, you know, thinking about voice and like how we design characters, you know, we could, these words are debatable. These are just the ones that I kind of came up with as I was watching them, but we want to get 3 for a lead vehicle. We want 3 to 4 adjectives that are going to define their voice. And if we were writing a novel, we'd build the voice off of this, right? Like we'd take our 3 to 4 personality traits and we'd be like, okay, how does somebody like that sound? What topics do they use? What words are common to them? What body language is common to them? What is their syntax or their cadence, like how do their sentences actually play out on the page, and then what's their pacing in a conversation. So I think part of what I found interesting is how different our lead vehicles are. So Benoit is very suspicious, cynical, manipulative, and dogged. Like he is very kind of dog with a bone, and you know, he's got interesting body language in that when he is in the worst version of himself, when he's apathetic and confused, he does things that become very manipulative. He flips a coin when he wants somebody to stop talking. He plays a piano key when he's like tired of them speaking out of nowhere. It really comes out of nowhere. Somebody's talking and all of a sudden he's just like, bang, and it's like, what just happened? It's his character is very manipulative in that way. He makes Marta throw up multiple times during the movie. Like, it's interesting to me that he is a hero in the story, but he's not a nice person. he's he's got a tough personality, and he's a tough character. I would imagine a vehicle like him would be very hard to write without a vehicle like Marta next to him, because he's not likable. You need to put him on a likable path. Like you need him to have a likable mission, which is I'm going to help somebody like Marta. So, and Rian Johnson does that for the second Benoit movie, for The Glass Onion. He gives him a different character than Marta, but a similar character in that the character is very likable, and Benoit is assisting that person. Benoit's growth arc, he starts confused and apathetic, and as he grows in a positive way, he becomes more and more engaged and more knowledgeable. So as Benoit grows positively, you watch him become more excited, until in the end he's literally like yelling at everybody, because he becomes more dogged. He loses some of the apathy at the beginning. So Rain communicates a lot of this with pacing, the amount that Benoit speaks, and with body language. As he gets more excited and engaged in the case, and he's growing how we, the reader, would want to see him grow in that positive way, he talks a lot more, and he is much more active with his body language. At the beginning of the show, he's slouched, he's laying, he's very passive, he doesn't speak very often, but as he's encouraged to become the best version of himself, which is the kind of dogged detective, he picks up that syntax and body language. Marta, on the other hand, she's compassionate, emotional, transparent, or honest, and very trusting. We see her at the beginning lost and anxious. She has a positive growth arc too, to this like secure and purposeful. So she moves, again, everybody in the movies everybody in the stories moving along this process of self-discovery and self-understanding. As the mystery unfolds, they all become more secure in who they are. So we see Benoit become more secure in his knowledge and engagement as a detective, and we see Marta become more secure in who she is and more purposeful in her actions. That was my analysis of the lead two. Did y'all see anything I missed, or anything you'd want to push back on?
Actually, it does make a lot of sense. I did not see it in those terms, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So a lot of times when I'm working with writers, when I'm coaching people, if you have a vehicle character, if your lead vehicle is unlikable, which is popular, right? Like lone wolves that like aren't that are cynical and jaded, especially in like science fiction or fantasy, those are real popular characters. You always want to pair them with a likable character, right? And it's very true in detective novels, because the detective is often an unrelatable expert, right? Like, you think of like the TV show Bones, which went on forever. Bones is a super nerd that has super knowledge, who's kind of mean to people and doesn't really play well with others. So you pair her with a charming and lovable fly by the seat of his pants ex-cop, and now you've got a team where like we relate to Bones through the people around her. Sherlock Holmes is an opiate addicted narcissist who like drives us all crazy and doesn't care about people. So you put him with a doctor who really cares about people, and now you have like a winning combination.
Right.
So if you find yourself writing scenes to take that out of the detective sphere, in Game of Thrones, we see that a lot. We get a lot of like vehicles that are Calvin, not that there's anything wrong with an opioid addicted narcissist. We get a lot of vehicles that are in the like Game of Thrones novels that are a little unbearable, right? Like Sansa Stark is a little unbearable. So you always have to, because she's like very high-minded and self-absorbed, so you have to put her with other vehicles. She has to be with Littlefoot, right? Because he balances her out. You have to have her with Ned, because the nobility of Ned balances her out, right? Like, so if you have an unlikable vehicle, make sure they're always around a likable vehicle, they'll balance each other out. Yeah. Okay, let's go to the next. Let's go to the supporting cast, the supporting vehicles. When we're talking supporting vehicles, you're gonna know most of them, I think, have negative growth. They have tragic growth arcs. So you have Richard. You'll see me defining these with less adjectives. They just don't have. They don't need the same depth because they don't have the same space in the story. So as you're building your plot, as you're thinking about your cast, you can make them less notes, right? Like for a lead vehicle that I'm going to see all the time, I want a more complex personality. For a side vehicle like this, I can do kind of a smaller personality drive. So Richard, we have this like explosive and petty. He moves in the story from scheming. He's constantly scheming. He's very suspicious of everything going on, to at the end of the story, he's completely out of control. His son's being arrested, and he looks back at the porch, and his wife has found out that he's cheating on her, and he has a look of like, oh no, everything's falling apart. Walter is this kind of weak and victimized character. He's hopeful at the beginning of the story. He's got grand plans for like taking over the publishing business and becoming the new kind of head of the family. At the end of the story, he's lost and without. I will say there's an absent scene for Walter and Joni. They don't quite have the growth resolution we want. And part of me thinks it's just there wasn't time to give it, but you do kind of want, you have a nice ending scene with Richard and Linda. You don't really get that ending with Walter and Joni. It's just kind of assumed from where the story was. Joni is that performative free spirit. She's entitled at the beginning, downright stealing from Harland, and again she ends without and kind of in a situation of desperation. And then you have Linda. She's professional and controlling. She's in the control at the beginning, and at the end, she grows to know the truth, but not in a good way, right? She sees that her world is actually just a veneer. Notice how we talk about when we're writing a big cast like this, we want to make sure they're all different. And Ryan Johnson does a really great job of giving us just in our vehicles, radically different characters that all have different personality traits. A lot of times like when you're writing the party scene, we keep coming back to where they're all at the party, or the living room scene where they're all sitting around a couch and Richard is talking about immigration and pulls Marta into this weird conversation where he's like asking her to speak for all immigrants everywhere. When that's happening, those scenes are much easier to write if you have really strong individualized voices, because the voices will start to write themselves. Does that make sense? Have y'all ever experienced that? Have you tried to write a scene with a huge cast like this?
No.
Anything over 5 characters is going to be tough. Anything over 3 starts getting hard. Anything over 5 is really tough to keep everybody balanced. You start playing popcorn where you're just tossing, like the voices are all popping in like a group discussion with each other. Usually you're going to have 1 or 2 characters driving that discussion. So if you want to go back and look at that couch scene of like how to write a giant cast scene, you've got Richard and Joni in conversation. And then the other characters are inserting themselves with their opinion on what's happening all the way through. Another one of those scenes is the will reading scene. In the will reading scene, you get Walter and Ransom in conversation, and everybody else is commenting on that conversation. So it's a cheap trick to write a like 5 to 7 person conversation, having 2 people talking and everybody else commenting on what's happening. Does that make sense? So it allows you to like have 2 drivers where you can have a one-on-one conversation, but you're inserting the other voices in. If the other characters all have very unique personalities like this cast does, it really hones in what's happening. It makes it easier to write. Sorry, that's what I meant. Hones you in on what's happening, makes it easier to write because the voices will do most of the work. Harlan's an interesting character. I think he has a positive growth arc. He goes from manipulative and kind of enjoying torturing everybody at the party to, by the end of the night, he's protective of Marta. So we get to see his altruistic side at the end. He's the only one of these supporting vehicles that has a positive growth arc. What that does, if you've got your lead vehicles with positive growth arcs, and then your supporting cast with a negative growth arcs, is it puts an us against them mentality. Somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose when we've got these competing growth arcs like this. If they're growing positive means Marta and Benoit lose, or Marta and Benoit winning means they're all going to be negative, you get this us versus them feel to the plot. And that's part of what the story's doing, is giving us this, like, either the family wins or Marta wins. You can't have both. Now they could have all chosen to be the best version of themselves in the story and gone the way of Harlan, and then you would have both Marta and the family winning, but they all choose not to. So that's what makes the competing choices. Let's talk about our side characters. We have, in addition to our 7 vehicles, we have 7, 8 side characters. The detectives really work as a single character. They're never a part. They're a chorus character. Now, they're an interesting chorus character because one of them is very calm and one of them is very earnest. So you get a good comedy pairing out of them, but they're never apart. They're always together. Ransom is a rebellious narcissist. So I'm going to distinguish side characters versus hazards. We'll talk about hazards in a minute. Side characters are going to play as engines or anchors to the vehicles. Hazards don't do that. So Ransom is this rebellious narcissist who's very manipulative. Meg is the other side character. She's helping and compassionate, right? So these 3 characters above the others have an impact on the vehicles and whether they're being encouraged to make positive or negative choices. Hazards are characters that show up that you just have to deal with. They don't necessarily have an inherent negative or positive impact on a vehicle. They're just present. So, and usually hazards are one note, right? Donna is entitled. Every time we see her, she's entitled. That's her note. She's entitled. Jacob is a Nazi. Every time you see Jacob, he's a Nazi, right? Like this is what I was talking about with Rain. He actually introduces these characters with their one note. They come in with that one note and they keep that one note. Donna, the first time we see her, she's being entitled. Jacob is introduced as your Nazi son, right? Like yeah. Fran is annoyed. She's always annoyed. Even when she's dying, she's annoyed, right? Like she's just always annoyed. Nana is always detached. It doesn't matter what's happening. Nana's a little delusional, detached. So hazard characters, you want them to be big voices, single note, and you space them through to create drama in the scene. But they don't have a direct impact on your vehicles. Your vehicles just have to decide which way to swerve around a hazard. So Rain's got 4 hazards in this one. Glass Onion, I was comparing the 2 in my notes as I was looking at them. Glass Onion, he has way less hazards. It's an interesting thing. In Glass Onion, he's got a bunch of vehicles and side characters, but he doesn't have all these hazards walking around. Really, the only hazard, I think, if I'm remembering Glass Onion, is there's a guy who lives in the house who's in the background. He's a hazard character. He's just kind of around. But that's he doesn't have this. In this one, he's got these 4 hazard characters that are kind of present. Any questions on hazards before we talk about how the casting engines and anchors? Okay. So we're talking. Let's take the 2 lead vehicles, and then we can take the other vehicles, the supporting vehicles, and how. So when we talk about whether a character is an engine or an anchor to the vehicle, we talk about whether that character pressure. Think of it as pressure. Is the character pressuring the vehicle to be the best version of itself, or is the character pressuring the vehicle to be the worst version of itself? So for Marta, the engines are going to make her feel secure and confident. They're going to encourage that behavior from her. When she's around Harlan, she speaks her mind. She's secure and confident. They have a established relationship that allows her to be strong around him. When she's around Meg, she's the best version of herself. She's strong, she's secure, she's confident. She's that Marta that we see at the end of the story. When she's around Ransom, and this is why we talk engines and anchors and not heroes and villains. Ransom is the villain, but he is Marta's engine. When she's around Ransom, she is confident and making decisions, right? Like she's not lost and anxious. Around Ransom, she kind of finds her voice. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's, if you want a scene where you want Marta to be strong, even if we're early in the plot, put her with Harlan playing Go, right? And then we're going to see that there's a confidence to her that's strong. Anchors for Marta are the family. Richard, Walter, Joni, and Benoit are all anchors. They make her anxious. They make her indecisive. They make her lost when she's around these characters. Notice I didn't put Linda over here. Linda and Marta don't actually ever interact, which is a weird. They have like some exchanging lines in large group scenes, but there's no actual scene where Linda has enough impact on Marta where I would say she's an engine or an anchor. They don't cross. So part of that, when you're planning, if you're looking at a big cast and you're writing a big cast, like, let's say you're doing a Game of Thrones fantasy novel, and you're like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and try to plot this out. Who's an engine and who's an anchor to who? You don't have to have all the characters on all the boards, right? Like, just think about who has true interaction with each other. That's where they go. Notice I don't put the detectives on Marta's side, because her only interaction with the detectives is through Benoit, right? Like when she's interacting with the detectives, Benoit is always present. So there's that, like, I don't need to think about how the detectives impact her because Benoit is going to drive that impact. So as you're using this to analyze your own work, like this tool to analyze your own work, think about, okay, do I even need to consider them? Because are they even part of this character's journey? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
For Benoit, we have that like apathetic, frustrated, unengaged to engaged and decisive. His engines are the detectives in Marta. His anchors are all of the family, which is why when he's interviewing the family, he seems very like frustrated and irritated and a little lost. As soon as the interview with Marta starts, he's starting to get engaged because Marta is his engine. When he goes off and talks to the detectives one-on-one, he's having a great time because they're his engine. Now, when we have one vehicle who's an anchor and one vehicle who's an engine, we get conflict, right? Because Marta doesn't want to be around Benoit, but Benoit wants nothing more than to be around Marta, because Marta is a positive force for him. Benoit is a negative force for her. So they're going to pull apart. So if you want like an odd couple pairing where they pull apart, if you want a Bert and Ernie situation, right? Bert is Ernie's engine, but Ernie is Bert's anchor. Bert makes everything great for Ernie. Ernie loves having Bert around. Ernie makes everything terrible for Bert. Bert hates having Ernie around. You get that pull against each other. So if you want to write characters that have that odd couple pull relationship, give them a common mission. Ernie and Bert have to live together on Sesame Street. Marta and Benoit both need this case solved. Common mission, but they're reverse engines and anchors. Marta is Benoit's engine, but Benoit is Marta's anchor. You'll get this pulling apart where Benoit's kind of chasing her all around, or Ernie's kind of chasing Bert all around to create ongoing conflict. Go. Okay. This is where it starts getting weird because we've got so many supporting vehicles. Now we're like, okay, we're getting crazy. But let's take them one at a time, right? Richard, well, so yeah, let's not take them one at a time. Let's point some things out in general. Marta is everybody's engine. Everybody is the better version of themselves when Marta is around. And Rian Johnson's very open about his characterization. They all talk about it. They all talk about how much they love Marta and how she's the positive force in the house. So she is everyone's engine, which creates a nice conflict in that they have to actively reject her to do what they want to do. Right? They have to throw her away, the positive influence that she is, in order to achieve their goals and grow in that negative way that they end up growing. They have to reject her completely. The narcissists share Ranson as an engine. Harlan pulls Ranson aside because he doesn't want Ranson surprised. He's actually being altruistic and compassionate toward Ranson. Right? So there's an engine relationship there, in the same way that Richard is less of a schemer and conniver when it comes to Ranson, which is, you want to cripple a vehicle, kill or arrest their engine at the end of the story, and you get Richard, chasing him out to the car. At the same time, Linda is not chasing Ranson out to the car because Ranson is one of her anchors. She's the worst version of herself. She feels out of control and chaotic when Ranson is in a scene. Right? So they have a conflicting relationship where Ranson makes her the worst version, encourages her to be the worst version of herself when he's around. Walter, surprisingly, this one surprised me, but watching Linda closely, Walter is an engine for Linda. She talks, again, Rian Johnson makes it easy. Linda talks multiple times about how she'd do anything for Walter. So Walter inspires her to be that professional, driven, together person. At the same time, everyone is an anchor to Walter. Walter doesn't like anybody. They all impact Walter in to be the worst version of himself. They're all kind of interfering with his ability to control things. So they all seem like obstacles. The more anchors you have, the more likely you are to fail. Right? So we know Walter's likely to fail from the beginning. We know Richard and Linda are likely to fail from the beginning. We know that Harlan's likely to fail from the beginning. The more engines you have, the more likely you are to succeed. So if we go back to our lead characters, Marta has support, probably the most support. In the end, we have kind of a confidence that she's likely to succeed. But it's not going to be easy because she's got a large amount of anchors causing chaos. Benoit, it's going to be much harder for him to succeed. He's got a lot of people causing chaos, but you give him kind of two engines and they become his driving force. I will do it because of these two people's influence on me. Does that make sense? Help you conceptualize engines and anchors a little? Any thoughts on that? Anything y'all want to talk about more?
A little short on time, but yeah, I thought Walt was actually a little bit of an engine for Marta because he, that confrontation outside her home sort of pushes her towards being more assertive and being more...
I could see that. Yeah, I could definitely see putting Walt in that engine category for her. He would be what we call Calvin's out. He would be what we call an engine that pushes, like a negative force that encourages her to be the best version of herself. Yeah. I can totally see that. Yeah. Do I have one more? No, that was my last one. Yeah, I think, the other thing is I think it's funny is Benoit's an anchor to everybody. He is a negative force to everybody. I think that's common in these large cast detective stories where there is a detective trying to specifically solve a crime. A lot of times this story is related to Clue, the movie, The difference
Hmm.
between this one and Clue is there is no Benoit in Clue.
Right. Yeah.
There's no one trying to solve the crime. They're all as confused as everybody else is. The different endings actually project different characters as the hidden Benoit. But this one, when you have a character like Benoit or like Poirot in the Agatha Christie novels, he does end up being a chaos agent, or like a Columbo. Columbo is always everybody's anchor. They all start getting pissed off when he shows up. Because he's there in direct opposition to their objections. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, that's what I had for cast analyzation. Any questions or anything we didn't cover that y'all want to talk about?
This is great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very-
I've written a couple big casts like this. They're a lot of fun. If you can nail their voices, they're super fun. Again, like clear voices make it way easier to like write their big scenes.
Yeah.
Knowing they're like having very tight personalities of like this character is always annoyed makes it really easy to just insert Fran into the back of a scene, right? It's that like knowing the voice helps you manage the cast and makes them all feel different. Their personality will start to direct how they operate in a scene when you write it.
Yeah. I saw some trivia that said, was it the Nazi son was based off all the internet trolls that hated The Last Jedi? Star Trek.
That's awesome.
Okay.
I love it.
Because I know was a lot of them.
Yeah. I think that's the perfect place to end.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if y'all have questions later, just drop them in the Slack. We can always talk about them in Slack.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.